So I was asked to cover the nutritional aspects of using byproducts and crop residues to limit feed cows in confinement. So that's going to be the focus of my talk. I was asked to do this part, but a lot of people are involved in this research at the University of Nebraska. So as well as myself, Rick Rasby and Terry Klopfenstein work on this as well. We have cows at Scottsbluff, and we have cows at Meade. And I think it's important that we thank Matt and Galen for letting us use their feedlots for cows. And then we have a graduate student, Jason Warner, who's working on this project and has been very helpful in getting all the data put together. And then, of course, we couldn't do this without the Ken and Carolyn Ng Foundation, and so we certainly appreciate that. So I just want to start with a little bit of a reminder of how stress impacts grass growth and why we typically think of confining cows, at least part of the time. When we have grass growth above the ground, we'll have root growth, root mass accumulation below the ground that will match that year's growth. And when we allow cattle to graze a plant and the plant does not get the opportunity to regrow, it does not get the opportunity to develop root mass either. So when we come in here and we let those cows graze that, and then there isn't much green to eat, and we keep hoping for rain, and we leave them out there, then they just keep coming back to that fresh green shoot. And this might have been something that would have happened to us in 2012 when we had such a horrific drought. But then the problem is, if this is your above ground line right here, in 2013 then, we didn't have much soil moisture, okay, because we'd had that drought, we didn't get a whole lot of rain. So the moisture in the soil profile may have been down here. In fact, I can tell you that it was. So what's going to happen to that plant? It's going to die. And so this is a reason that's very important for us if we're going to maintain our land, that we might need to feed cows in confinement. And I think, unfortunately for many of us, chronic drought conditions are, honestly, we have more drought years than we seem to have rain years, don't we? So having a backup plan for what we're going to do when we need to get those cows out of there, instead of just thinking maybe it'll rain, is something we need to have prepared. But there are other things that may cause us to need to rethink confining cows. The drought thing, the lack of grass, that's kind of our normal thing that we've always kind of considered is when we would confine cows. But we have other things happening in the industry now. One of those is more acres of crop production, and that tends to come from what was pasture land. We have more urbanization for the increasing population, and that tends to come from something that used to be grassy fields. So because of those things, we have an increased value to the grass that we do have. So when we have this increased value of grass, maybe we need to be rethinking the utilization of our grass. We've always thought in the past that the best place to maintain that cow was out on cheap grass. It was a good place for her to be, okay? It wasn't expensive. But as that changes, as land values change and grass becomes more of a prime commodity, maybe we need to start rethinking what we consider the value of that grass to be, what use that grass should be. So maybe it's time to think about high quality grass for gain on calves that are going to gain rapidly, and that cow being maintained more on residues and byproducts, things that we can acquire cheaper. So this is why we are considering confinement feeding, while we're doing the research in confinement feeding, that this may be something that becomes more of a norm, not just during drought, and maybe not for an entire 12 months of her production cycle, but are there times in her production cycle that she should be confined, okay? Not just cows that are culls and we're fattening them up. Sometimes we think, well, yeah, that's a cow in the feedlot, but what about this cow in production? And I don't know how well you can see this, but here's a baby calf eating at the bunk with his mom. So clearly that's not a cull cow. So limit feeding cows in confinement really becomes the key there. And Dr. Ng indicated that too, that letting those cows eat all they want to eat is not going to be a very economical means of maintaining those cows in the feedlot. But if we can feed them energy-dense byproducts and mix those with low-quality crop residues, then we can limit dry matter intake, and we can still maintain that cow's condition so that she's still a productive cow, and we can reduce the cost of that as opposed to letting her eat whatever she wants. But when we do this in confinement, then there's concepts that we have to either shift our mindset about, or we at least have to take into consideration when we're deciding this is what we're going to do. So one of those concepts that we need to have square in our minds is the nutrient content of the feedstuffs we're going to have available for that cow in that situation. So this is a picture of some cattle consuming distiller's grains. And this is one of the things that makes this possible is high energy byproducts. But for our cattlemen, we need to have a little bit of a mindset shifting here, because I'm constantly harping on them, I know, and I'm sure most of you as consultants do too, that we need you to have your hays or your feed samples analyzed by a commercial laboratory. I can't help you if I don't know what you're working with. This kind of thing. We want them to get a commercial testing done on the feed. And the important thing to remember is that the TDN values on those commercial feed reports are a calculated value from ADF. And that works fairly well to determine what the energy content of their hays are. And we can balance some rations from there fairly well from that information. But since it's based on ADF, and many of our byproducts are a high fiber source, although it's a highly digestible source, a calculated value on some of that is going to give you a lower energy value than that feedstuff actually provides in feeding trials. So the problem with that can be, if we use those lower values and calculate those diets, then we're going to assume we have to feed a lot more than we do, and we're adding a lot of expense to a system we're going to have to, our whole point here is that we're trying to decrease the cost of this feeding as much as we can. So that's an issue. If we overestimate it, then of course we're not going to feed enough. And so what I have suggested and what I've put in the proceedings that you got was some values that we are pretty comfortable using at the University of Nebraska, because it's based on feeding trials that were done here. So for distiller's grains, whether it's wet, dry, modified, or solubles, we're pretty comfortable using 108% TDN for that commodity. Not a lot of you are going to have access to sugar beet pulp. I'm in Scottsbluff, so we do have that in our area. From feeding trials, we've come up with about 90% TDN for that. Soy hulls, 70, Synergy, 105. You can just go through and look at all the different ones. We also put corn in there just as a reference point, and also to remind you that in a high roughage diet, of course it doesn't have quite the value that it does in a finishing diet. We're using 43% TDN for wheat straw and corn stalks. And just as a reference point then for what those cows might be on if they weren't in confinement would be Sandhills meadow hay is what we used. And of course there's a range on that too, just like there is any hay, but 60 is a nice average of where that might come in as opposed to stalks and your byproducts. The other important thing in balancing diets for these cows is not only the nutrient content of the feeds that you have to work with, knowing what you need to use there for values, but also understanding the requirement differences in these cows. In this picture, you have cows that have baby calves that are rapidly approaching 8 weeks of age. Okay. Her energy requirement right now is vastly different than these cows down here, who have had their calves weaned off of them, so they're not lactating, and they're about mid-gestation with their new calf. Their requirement's pretty low. Okay, there's a lot of difference there. And some of the things that we ran into with producers this year, when we had this drought in 12 and we had to pull cows out and couldn't go to pastures in 13 because we still didn't have rain, we didn't have grass, and they were moving from winter feeding of cows like they typically have to do, and then they didn't go to grass when they calved. They ran into a little bit of a problem here because this cow started losing a lot of weight on him, and they said, well, you know, I increased the amount of the protein cube that I was giving him, but by the time that cow gets to that stage, energy becomes her first limiting nutrient, and that's what they were running into. In a typical, what their mindset, what they were used to dealing with, was only providing protein, because they're used to dealing with the cow who is, you know, somewhere out here and on her way up. These cows would normally be out on grass, and so sure, her energy need goes up, but that's not what they typically deal with because the grass was providing that. So that mindset shift that the only feed this cow's going to get has to come from you, and what does she need at this point, was a little bit of shift for some of the people that I was working with. So we had to go back through some of this. So this is the energy requirements of the cows that we had on our study with the June 15th calving date. When we get to July out here, they're really increasing their energy needs, but then the blue line represented the normal wean, so those calves would not come off the cows until your typical 205-day weaning weight, whereas the red line continues to represent the early weaned. And so once you take the calf away, her nutrient needs are quite different than if she were to stay up here and be nursing a calf, and the calf stay with her and need to eat as well. So just knowing those energy needs as well as their metabolizable protein needs at the stage that they're in becomes a critical thing. So another important thing is how you handle the diet to meet the needs of the cow and the calf. And there's a couple of different things that we can do when those needs change like that. Because they're in confinement, actually it becomes very easy to meet those needs and not overfeed or underfeed, because you know what their nutrient needs are, you're supplying the feed. And you can either change what's in the diet or you can change the amount. There's two ways to change the amount of energy that the cow receives. Okay, so, and I mentioned this in the paper, I guess I haven't mentioned it up here, but when we're talking limit feeding, we're talking less than 2% of her body weight. We can increase her feed and still be limit feeding if we go from 1.7% of her body weight to 1.8 or 9. She's still being limit fed, but we can change some of those things. So in this diet contains some silage, some distillers, and some straw. Okay, works pretty nice. So this is a table that just shows you some example diets that can be used. Here we have, on a dry matter basis, for example, 57% distillers, 43% straw. This one would be 30% distillers, 70% straw on a dry matter basis. So all those options are set up that way. We have the pounds of dry matter intake that the late gestation cow would need on that diet to meet her needs, what her lactating counterpart would need, and then the cow with at least a 60-day-old calf, what she would need. Because there's a third component that we have to remember when we're feeding cows through their production cycle and they're confined, is that our research at the University of Nebraska suggests that once this calf is 60 days old or so, he starts eating about 1% of his body weight in forage, even if he's still nursing the cow. So if he's still in the same pen with the cow that's confined, he's going to start eating some of her feed. And you have to account for that if you're not going to, until you early wean him and put him in his own pen. So that has to come into play depending on where you are in her cycle, and if you're still confining them or in the same pen or whatever you do. So different diets will allow you to meet that cow's needs differently. If we're going to stick with this diet, we just simply increase this for every stage that she improves. An example of how we would just change the energy and not the actual pounds of dry matter would be if we were going to use this 30-70 diet, which is one of them I really like. This would be a Terry Klopfenstein diet. This is my diet. But it doesn't matter. You would be feeding her 19 pounds of dry matter here. If I moved her to this 20% distillers, 35% straw, 45% beet pulp diet, she could be lactating with the 60-day-old calf and still be eating the same pounds as her late gestation counterpart, and I didn't change anything. I just changed the diet, and she didn't have any changes in fill or whatever. So 2 ways we can go about affecting that change. So I threw in this example diet from one of the trials that I had conducted out there at Scottsbluff. You can tell it was at Scottsbluff and not Mead because it has beet pulp in it. But I included it because my point was a lot of times when we talk about byproducts and residues and things, automatically your thought process is that it has to be ethanol byproducts. And for some regions of the country, those are harder to come by than others. And so my point in including this was we were able to include a regionally available byproduct, reduce the amount that we had to feed of the distiller's grains, but it didn't have to be this one. It could be whatever's available in your area as long as you have a good handle on the TDN and the protein that that byproduct has. So this was one option that we did. We had 60% straw, 20% distillers, 20% beet pulp. Over here we were able to increase that beet pulp to 45 and decrease our wheat straw quite a bit. The other thing that I liked about these diets was that the dry matter of them makes them fairly easy to store either in ag bags or a silo or a bunker made of straw or whatever you want to do in the event that you have seasonal availability of certain byproducts. And that would be the case with beet pulp. Not only is it only regionally available, it's also seasonally available. So if what you're dealing with is something that you can get a lot of a certain time of year and not another time of year, and it's much cheaper that time of year, then there are diet options that you can even mix in advance and store. So keeping that mixture under 50% dry matter is very helpful in that process. So this would be the actual results of the trial where we fed those 2 diets, either with the 20% pulp or the 45% pulp. And what you see in this is that initial body weight was similar for the cows, initial body condition score was similar, but that same thing happened with final body weight and final condition. There were no real differences. And we've had this, we've done several different gestating trials at the University of Nebraska where we fed different combinations of byproducts, put different things in there. And the bottom line of that, the reason I'm showing you this, is because it really doesn't matter what your byproducts are, what commodities you have in there. What keeps these cows in similar body condition is if you balance that diet to contain the same amount of energy. If you balance to meet her energy requirements, she'll maintain weight, even if the amount she's being fed is only 15 pounds of dry matter or 13 pounds of dry matter. You can actually get pretty creative, and what I found in a drought is that producers can get really creative. So that was some work that we had done initially with the gestating cow, but it became important to do this with a lactating cow, and in our research, our cows are confined 12 months out of the year. Dr. Klopfenstein is going to talk about the economics, and he's probably going to tell you that 12 months of confinement is maybe not the most economical thing, but we needed to see how this worked for every stage of the production cycle that the cow was going to be in. So in the research trial, the cows are always confined. So what we did was, after 90 days, they were fed a 60% wet distillers and 40% straw or stalks. And again, that was somewhat dependent on location. We have a lot of wheat straw out in the Panhandle. The guys at Meade tend to feed more corn stalks because that's what they have available. So we just varied the diet based on, we kept the energy requirement or the energy in the diet the same, used different commodities based on regional availability. And the early weaned cows only got 15 pounds of dry matter, and the late weaned pairs were getting 22. They weren't really late weaned, but they were your typical 205 versus a 90. So we had one location. This would be the Meade location. This would be the Scotts Bluff location. The cows pre-breeding were the same weight. At normal weaning time, so this would have been, for these particular cows, it would have been January, for the 205 day, whether they were early weaned back in September or not, would be this line up here. So early weaned would be when the calf was taken off of them at 90 days. These stayed the 205. This is at that 205 date time. And so while we did have one group that was different from the other three, there wasn't a clear-cut difference between the body weight on the cows, whether they were early weaned or late weaned. And that same tendency held for their body weight change. And then body condition score, these cows were just a little over a 5. These were at a 5. By the time we got to that normal weaning time, they were, all but these girls were 5.1. So the ones at Meade just lost just a little bit. These at Scotts Bluff gained just a little bit. But again, these cows are all at least in a condition score 5, which what I'm finding with some producers is they want to see those cows in a 6 or better, because that's what they would be if they were out on grass getting to eat everything they wanted. And that's not necessarily economical for me to feed these cows to a 6. I just need to feed them enough to maintain. So sometimes that's what I'm talking about. Sometimes this is going to take a little bit of a mindset shift on what's okay. The calves during this time frame started out no statistical difference, and these 3 were all the same. These 2 were not different, so there really wasn't a clear-cut early weaning versus non-weaning, late weaning differences. Same with average daily gain. And this was our first year of data. I should maybe point that out. And we are, again, repeating this. Body condition scores are your typical 1 to 9. I probably should have told you that too. So what we did during that time frame was to hold daily dry matter intake the same on those. So we were trying to get at the energetics behind this. So we wanted everyone to have the same amount of energy. So the diets were the same, whether it was fed to a weaned calf, a dry cow, or a pair. We fed that same diet so that we could compare energetics of the 2 systems. So this would be the amount of intake of the weaned calves. So they got ad libitum intake in their own little pen. And then we had it set what we felt was maintenance for that weaned cow. So that's what she got. Then the pairs got as close to this as we could. So it was very similar. So that's how we fed them. And basically, from the data that I just showed you, there really weren't differences between the 2 systems. So there really wasn't differences in energetics. This may clarify a little bit. Jason made this for me. This is the normal weaned pairs, and this would be the intake of the cows, then the intake that was added that we assumed was what the calves were eating, and then once the calves were removed. So you can see how we did that. So what that really boils down to on this is that early weaning didn't really affect the energetics of how the system worked, but it's a good management tool. Okay? So it allows you to manage the cattle differently. So if I had a pivot of really high quality forage, but I didn't have enough to put all the pairs out there. I can wean the calves, I can put the young calves out on it, and then now I have a dry cow, and I can go put her on a very low maintenance diet of residues or whatever, because now I can feed her 13 pounds of dry matter and not worry about her. There were no differences in pregnancy rate, but Rick Rasby is going to talk to you in depth about that, so I'm just going to skip over. But if I didn't say something, you wouldn't listen to the rest of the slides, because you'd be like, well, what was that? So some of the things from our experience, and I hope you can see this okay, but the calves did learn to eat with their mothers. That was the beauty of the system. These were some things that we learned that we didn't know that we were going to learn. I guess that's the beauty of research. But here's the cows standing here at the bunk, and here's the calves in there eating with them. They learned what a feed truck was, so our experience was that weaning went very well too, because they already knew what that was bringing. Management considerations, calves learn to drink from a trough very, very early. And there's some misconception that as long as a baby calf is on a lactating cow, he's not going to dehydrate. And that's not necessarily true, especially in our case where our cows are calving in late June, July. That baby calf has some significant need for water pretty early on. So you have to be able to get it to them. They have to be able to reach it. And we didn't have any calves dehydrating, but we watched that very carefully. Bunk space is important. They're limit fed. So separating off young cows from older cows is important, because anybody bossy is going to get there first. There's no room for the timid cow in this deal, because anybody standing back isn't going to get much. And so making sure that there's bunk space for everybody to get there at the same time is important. So 2 foot per head for the adults, and then 1 to 1.5 foot for the calves. And then this is the pen space for the rest of the day that we felt was necessary. So here's some pictures. Here's a baby calf. He's got to be able to eat. He's got to be able to reach it, okay? So some feedlot pens were designed for obviously much bigger than a baby calf, so need to make sure that they can actually reach that. Got to be able to reach the water. Can't be having cows push them away from the water, and you can't have such restricted flow that the cows come up and drink and the tank's really low and the calf can't reach. Sure, he can reach the tank, but he can't reach the water in the tank. And you got to watch that, but you would have to watch that whether they were confined or not. But my point being, in confinement, they're pretty much dependent on you to do all this. This is just a picture that I got from Rick Rasby, because we tend to think confinement in a feedlot, and doesn't have to be in a feedlot. You can get pretty creative to do this. Had a lot of producers doing this in confinement on their places this year. This particular picture is confinement on a pasture, and the second half of my job description is range management, so I always have to put a disclaimer on this that limit feeding on a pasture, cattle are going to continue to consume forage, so you're going to still suffer some overgrazing there. So the best place to do this, if you're not in a feedlot, is winter feed ground, crop ground, pivot corners, something like that, rather than a good pasture that you just keep hoping that it's going to rain on. So lots of bunk space. We added some limestone for each cow because of the high phosphorus content of the diets we were using. We added rumensin. That's going to be talked about tomorrow, I believe. Should always monitor sulfur and fat levels if you're using distillers byproducts. We used various grind sizes and got along. We've had people mix wheat straw and distillers in a vertical mixer and get along okay. So you can get creative about this. But by the same token, commercial feedlots may be a really good option for some of this, because they may have empty pens and they may be willing to feed cows or pairs. How much that's going to cost a producer is going to depend on where they go with the cows and what they need them to do. If the cows are going to have to be AI'd, or what other management things are going to be going on during the time that the cows are there. But the one thing I would also add to this is that the advantage of the feed yards that some cattlemen don't have is a feed truck and a mixer. In our area, sometimes it's really hard to get access to the distillers if you're a rancher, but the feedlot guys may have access to some of those commodities or may be able to take it in bigger loads and that kind of thing. And so there can be advantages to this, but there has to be a price on the feedlot guys' side of this too. It has to be a win-win for both people. So the mindset shift for limit feeding cows in a feedlot is another thing that I've kind of run into this year. People in a feedlot feed out finishing cattle. And we don't tend to limit intake on finishing cattle. We want them to eat and eat some more and finish quickly. And so the people running that a lot of times have a hard time limit feeding something like this for the maintenance of the cow. And so, I tell somebody to go to this feedlot, see if they'll feed these cows, and they come back and they're like, here's what they said it was going to cost and here's how much they're going to feed. Because they're of that mindset that we're going to feed that cow everything she wants to eat. And that's going to get expensive really fast in that situation. So changing that mindset is important. The fact that slick bunks are okay, that's just every feedlot person's nightmare, isn't it? They just hate that. And it's okay. And the cheapest resources are the best. So we don't have to feed those cows the most expensive things that we have. We can feed them pretty cheap stuff. Consistency in feeding time, I think, is important in this cow because she gets into a routine of when the feed truck's going to be there. She lays down the pen the rest of the time. So it's really important, I think, to get them on a schedule where she always knows that truck is coming at the same time. It can't be something like, well, when we get everything else done, somebody ought to go feed those cows. They have to be on a schedule just like everything else. So my summary here, energy density is the key to limit feeding cows, okay? Lactation is going to increase the energy needs considerably, and that has to be taken into account if those cows are in confinement during that period. Early weaning options may allow you to better use the resources that you do have, just simply stated. Confining calves, or if you confine the calves, they have to be able to reach the water in the feed. And you're going to have plenty of bunk space and a consistent routine. Thank you.